House of the Dragon is an epic fantasy series about a royal family at war with itself. On the one side, we have Rhaenyra Targaryen, the eldest child of the late King Viserys Targaryen, who considers the Iron Throne her birthright. On the other side, we have her younger half-brother Aegon Targaryen, the eldest son of King Viserys, who was kind of browbeaten into sitting the throne by his mother and his grandfather and by general patriarchal inertia. The show is based on the book Fire and Blood by George R. R. Martin, the same author who wrote A Song of Ice and Fire, which HBO adapted as Game of Thrones. Fire and Blood tells the tale of how these two factions go to war in a Pyrrhic conflict that forever weakens the Targaryen dynasty. Such are the wages of avarice, hatred, and lust for power. By and large, the first season of House of the Dragon was very well received. Things took a turn in Season 2, which a lot of fans, myself included, considered a step down. The button came about a month after the Season 2 finale aired on HBO, when George R. R. Martin himself ripped the show a new one. In a since-deleted blog post called Beware the Butterflies, Martin bemoaned that the show had cut a character from his book named Maelor Targaryen, who played a key role in a in a hotly anticipated child murder scene. Basically, Martin was concerned that without Maelor, a bunch of other things later in the story wouldn't make any sense, and he wasn't convinced that showrunner Ryan Condal had anything planned to replace them. So he feared the butterfly effect, and warned that there are larger and more toxic butterflies to come if House of the Dragon goes ahead with some of the changes being contemplated for seasons 3 and 4. I want to underline how crazy this was. George R. R. Martin is credited as a creator and an executive producer on the show. House of the Dragon cuts him a paycheck, so it is in his best interest for as many people to watch it as possible. And yet here he is, slagging the show off in public. And he was willing to do that, so far as I can tell, because he cares a lot about the things he writes, and he was upset that the show was changing so much about his book. I mean, I was upset too, and I only read the thing. I can only imagine how the author felt. What made it extra irritating wasn't just that they changed the book, but that they changed it for the worse. We're going to look at exactly how today on Psst, please like and subscribe. Pass it on. The first season of House of the Dragon, the one that everyone liked, stuck pretty close to the source material, and the changes that were made went over very well. For instance, in Fire and Blood, King Viserys is kind of an afterthought of a character. He mostly exists so he can die and his family members can fight over his kingdom. But on House of the Dragon, he becomes this conflicted, tormented man who wants Rhaenyra to inherit his throne, partly out of love, partly out of guilt, partly out of superstition. But when other claimants arise, he's too dithering and weak to really push back. So he sort of sets the stage for this civil war despite having the best of intentions. As Martin wrote on his blog, the show version of King Viserys is so much more powerful and tragic and fully fleshed than my own version in Fire and Blood that I am half tempted to go back and rip up those chapters and rewrite the whole history of his reign. On the flip side, the first time I became really concerned for the show was in the penultimate episode of Season 1, The Green Council. So King Viserys has just died, and instead of coronating Rhaenyra like he would have wanted, the king's wife and advisors crown his son Aegon instead. In the book, Aegon is crowned at the Dragon Pit and then flies a few laps around the city of King's Landing to celebrate, which sounds pretty easy to adapt, right? That sounds more or less straightforward. But the show goes in a different direction. While Aegon is being crowned on the show, another character named Rhaenys Targaryen sneaks into the Dragon Pit, mounts her dragon, crashes up through the floor, menaces Aegon and his mother Alicent, and then flies away, rather than attack any of the people she thinks are stealing Rhaenyra's throne. So not only is this extremely different from what happens in the book, it's kind of dumb on its face. You know, the episode frames Rhaenys as merciful and restrained for not attacking Aegon when she had the chance.
A war is like to be fought over this treachery, to be sure. But that war is not mine to begin.
But it ignores that she massacres God only knows how many peasants during her big entrance, something that is never brought up again. And without spoiling things too much, there's another scene later in the story where the Dragon Pit gets wrecked, but now if they have it, it's not going to have as big an impact, because it's already wrecked. You know, if you make a big change like this from the book, you should be sure that it's actually going to improve the story, which this did not. It's kind of silly and loud and doesn't make much sense, which is a problem, given that House of the Dragon is a Game of Thrones prequel show, and Game of Thrones trained its audience to examine plot lines from every angle to pick up on clues. Game of Thrones fans will notice if there are big gaping holes in the story. That's one of the reasons the final season of that show went over so poorly, because it stopped caring about the details. What's more, the Dragon Pit scene seems to have been changed on a whim. As writer Sarah Hess said,
I just remember we were in the writer's room one day and I was like, it would be awesome if Rhaenys just came through the floor on a dragon.
Well, that doesn't bode well, does it? The biggest way House of the Dragon changes Fire and Blood involves the relationship between Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen and her former best friend slash enemy slash soulmate Alicent Hightower. In the book, Alicent is Rhaenyra's stepmother, and that's about it. Alicent marries Rhaenyra's father, the king, after Rhaenyra's mother dies, and while the two women aren't super close, they more or less get along until Alicent gives birth to Aegon and decides she'd rather see her own son on the throne than Rhaenyra. Factions form, and the rest is fake history. The show changes things so that Alicent and Rhaenyra are the same age and have a very close friendship before things go sideways, which I thought was pretty ingenious. In the book, these two end up as bitter enemies on opposite sides of a brutal civil war, so it would be all the more tragic, I figured, if they started as friends. They'd have further to fall. It would be more dramatic and heartbreaking. But once again, the show goes in a different direction. Alicent and Rhaenyra are at odds for a few episodes in the first season. At one point, Alicent pulls a knife on Rhaenyra's son in a great scene that punches up all the right bits from the book, but after a time jump, she's repented and is ready for Rhaenyra to inherit the throne. And even after the war really gets going in season 2 and her own son Aegon is on the throne, Alicent still kind of wants Rhaenyra to have it. The show constructs these painfully contrived scenes where the two cross enemy lines to meet in secret. Rhaenyra, one of the most famous people in the Seven Kingdoms, does a whole sister act thing where she dresses as a septa and meets Alicent in King's Landing, where anybody could recognize her. For me, the death blow came in the season 2 finale, where Alicent crosses a naval blockade to meet Rhaenyra on her home base of Dragonstone. Alicent offers to help Rhaenyra take King's Landing and the Iron Throne, and then gives Rhaenyra permission to execute her own son Aegon as a usurper, all on the assumption that a woman she was friends with in childhood will make a better ruler than her kid, who at this point is bedridden after taking a wound in battle, by the way. Setting aside whether this makes any dramatic sense, it's obviously way off book. You know, in Fire and Blood, Rhaenyra and Alicent are acquaintances who become enemies. But in the show, they are best friends who become bitter exes who become secret allies, working together to pull the Seven Kingdoms back from the brink of war. And while that is a worthy goal, it's pretty much the opposite of what happens in Fire and Blood, where both sides eagerly participate in a bloody conflict that gets harder and harder to stop the longer it goes on. That doesn't mean they don't have second thoughts or sometimes pause to contemplate the horror of it all, but they all want to win the war, because they're ambitious, because they're hurt, because they want revenge, or because they're entitled, or whatever. But House of the Dragon puts Rhaenyra and Alicent at the center, and then decides they're not really motivated by any of that stuff, that these two want perfect, objective peace, which basically means that the story moves forward despite the best efforts of the two main characters. It makes for really sluggish watching in season 2, where most of the best episodes happen without them. So the way House of the Dragon approaches the story takes a lot of gas out of the dramatic engine. The next question is, why? Why would they change the book in a way that makes the story worse? To be fair to the writers, Fire and Blood does lend itself to multiple interpretations. It's not a traditional narrative novel, but a fake history book, pieced together years after the fact by a guy named Archmaester Gildane, who's working with incomplete and contradictory sources. So sometimes the book will give us multiple versions of events. For instance, all the sources agree that something happened between Rhaenyra and this uptight Kingsguard knight named Sir Criston Cole, but it's unclear whether she rejected his advances or he hers. In the show, we learn that they had a fling, and that ultimately Rhaenyra turned Criston down when he wanted to run away together. So that's a good example of the show clarifying the ambiguity that was already there in the text. I have no problem with that. But there is a very big difference between that and then making things up out of absolutely nowhere. Things like... And those are the changes I'm really talking about here. Why make those kinds of huge, sucky changes? About a month before the second season of House of the Dragon premiered on HBO, George R. R. Martin wrote on his blog about the nature of adaptation. Everywhere you look, there are more screenwriters and producers eager to take great stories and make them their own. No matter how major a writer it is, no matter how great the book, there always seems to be someone on hand who thinks he can do better, eager to take the story and improve on it. They never make it better, though. 999 times out of 1,000, they make it worse. If you have notes on the impression, feel free to sound off.
The books.
Martin doesn't name House of the Dragon in that post, but I think it's pretty safe to say it was on his mind. And I think he gets to the heart of it. I think the producers on House of the Dragon had ideas on how to make Fire and Blood their own, and I think a lot of those ideas just weren't very good. This video is called When Shows Hate Their Source Material, and that may be overstating things just a tad. I don't know whether the producers actually hate Fire and Blood, but I do know they don't respect it enough to honor the basics. And I do get a whiff of contempt when I look at interviews. Remember Sarah Hess from before?
It would be awesome if Rhaenys just came through the floor on a dragon.
Alongside showrunner Ryan Condal, Hess is one of the main creative forces behind House of the Dragon. And here's what she told The Hollywood Reporter after season 1 aired. In Fire and Blood, the history was written by these unreliable narrators, and nobody really knows what happened in those rooms. They know the big events that happened historically, but they don't know what anyone's intention was. And history is often written by men who write off women as crazy or hysterical or evil and conniving or gold-digging or sexpots. Like in the book, it says Rhaenyra had kids and got fat. Well, who wrote that? We were able to step back and go, the history tellers want us to believe that Alicent is an evil, conniving bitch. But is that true? Who exactly is saying that? This feels like a very reductive reading of Fire and Blood to me. Like, take Rhaenyra. In the book, we see her as a leader, as a politician, a mother, a wife, a daughter. She makes measured decisions and she makes rash decisions. Sometimes she's eager for vengeance, and sometimes she holds back for fear of shedding unnecessary blood. She emerges as a pretty complicated person who definitely can't be reduced to she had kids and got fat. But I feel like Sarah Hess is pretending she can, because that way she has an excuse to make a new personality for Rhaenyra for TV. Bit of a side note, I always thought it was weird that Hess gave she had kids and got fat as an example of history writing off Rhaenyra, because it implies that the book is somehow insulting Rhaenyra by mentioning her weight, even though there's obviously nothing wrong with being fat. You know, I'm not upset that they didn't follow the book and hire a plus-size actor to play Rhaenyra. I think Emma Darcy does a fantastic job. But if they had, I would have respected that choice a lot, because there are very few bigger actors leading a show like this. That would have actually been subversive and daring. Instead, I have this image of the writers like high-fiving each other for being brave enough to go against the book and cast a thin person on TV. How groundbreaking. Getting back on track, I also think Hess misreads Alicent. The history tellers want us to believe Alicent is an evil, conniving bitch. Again, as someone who's read the book, I have to ask, where? Yes, in the book, Alicent plots to put her own son on the throne and to keep Rhaenyra off of it. But there's nothing inherently evil about that. She wants what's best for her family, and she doesn't want violence. After Alicent learns about Rhaenyra's son dying in the early days of the war, she's horrified. She goes pale, crying, "Mother, have mercy on us all." So she's not just some vengeance monster. Like Rhaenyra, Alicent seems pretty well-rounded in the book. And here's the bigger question I think kind of gets to the heart of what's going on here. What exactly is supposed to be wrong about Alicent plotting to put her son on the throne? Why does Alicent, working to advance her own family's interests, make her, in Sarah Hess's eyes, an evil, conniving bitch? That feels like more play acting to me, because Fire and Blood doesn't really make moral judgments about its characters like that. In fact, we're often given conflicting perspectives on who they are as people. And that's in keeping with George R. R. Martin's work generally. His characters are often pretty hard to pin down. Game of Thrones, which Sarah Hess has admitted to not watching, is full of characters who do horrible things and do decent things. They're kind of hero or villain depending on the day. Our introduction to Jaime Lannister is him pushing a child out a window, and yet we later learn that he saved a whole city from destruction. The Hound, by his own admission, is a brutal killer, and yet he helps the Stark sisters on multiple occasions. Melisandre burns a kid at the stake but she also brings back Jon Snow, and she seems to honestly want to save the world from the coming apocalypse. I'm not saying the show always gets this dance right, and there are characters who are just flat out awful and meant to be that way, but in general, I really like that Game of Thrones just lets these characters sit with their contradictions and doesn't toss them into good or bad buckets. And that goes double for the Song of Ice and Fire books, which are even more thorny. Fire and Blood does have these sorts of characters in it, but it feels like House of the Dragon chooses good guys and bad guys for us. Like, who are we supposed to root for in this matchup? Rhaenyra, who constantly tries to avoid unnecessary violence?
I inherited 80 years of peace from my father. Before I was to end it, I needed to know that there was no other path.
Or Aegon's brother Aemond, who assumes the throne when Aegon is injured and burns a town full of people alive because he's angry, which he does not do at this point in the book, by the way. Or remember how the show let Rhaenys, a Rhaenyra supporter, off the hook for killing all those peasants? Well, when Aegon unjustly executes a bunch of rat catchers in the second season, his grandfather chews him out. And he should be chewed out. And it's a really good scene, which Sarah Hess wrote, by the way, so all credit to her. But I can't help but notice how the show frames this stuff. Aegon is wrong for what he did, but Rhaenys is
Awesome.
Basically, the show feels like it's chosen Rhaenyra as the hero, and anyone against Rhaenyra is a not hero. I'm also not the first, second, or 8,000th person to notice some gender coding going on here. Remember that Hess said that history is often written by men who write off women as crazy or hysterical or evil and conniving or gold-digging or sexpots. Now, that's kind of a weird thing to say in its face, because Fire and Blood isn't history and wasn't written by men. The whole history book thing is a conceit, and the book was written by one guy, George R. R. Martin, who they can call if they want to know his intention. But my whole thesis here is that the writers are kind of ignoring or misinterpreting the actual content of Fire and Blood, so they feel better about making up a whole new story. And in this new story, they want to avoid those kinds of stereotypes and cliches about women, which is a worthwhile goal. They also drill down on the book's critique of patriarchal power, which is absolutely there. You know, this whole succession crisis starts because too many people in Westeros are unwilling to accept women like Rhaenys or Rhaenyra as leaders. The writers on House of the Dragon did not invent that angle. It's very much there in the text. But they also don't trust it to work as written. They change things up. And the end result is that a lot of the female characters in particular feel toothless, incoherent, or even kind of regressive. Take the information broker Mysaria, who in the book is a major part of an assassination plot that ends up killing King Aegon's young son. Revenge, after Rhaenyra's own son Luke, is also killed. On the show, she's only involved in this plot the barest, tiniest bit, I guess so we don't think she's too cold-blooded. Another example involves Alicent Hightower's only daughter by the king, Helaena Targaryen, who is married to her full-blooded brother King Aegon, because Targaryens are wild like that. In the season 2 premiere, Helaena is in the room as, this gets kind of dark, fair warning. She's in the room as that assassination plot I mentioned kicks into gear, and a man decapitates her young son. In the book, Helaena has a mental breakdown after this. You know, she becomes depressed, she won't eat, she won't leave her room. But on the show, 2 episodes later, she's saying stuff like this.
I feel sad about Jaehaerys. But I ought not to, I think. People die all the time.
It's okay. They cut off my kid's head in front of me, but you know, life goes on. I have this horrible feeling that the writers cut out Helena's grief because they wanted to avoid the cliche where a woman acts crazy and hysterical. So instead, we have a character who just doesn't have much of a reaction to seeing her own son get decapitated, which I don't think is better. And then there's Alicent herself, who really is the poster child for a lot of these problems. In the book, Alicent actively plans to put Aegon on the throne, but on the show, the men around her plan it without telling her, and she's blindsided. And I get that there's a statement here about the way powerful men shut women out when it comes time to make important decisions, but think about what's being lost in translation here. The writers have taken a character who has agency in the book, Alicent is a key figure in planning this coup, and turned her into a character without agency on the show, where she's kept in the dark. If the writers are trying to avoid stereotypes, turning this woman from a participant into a bystander feels like a step back, not forward. The show kind of pays lip service to the book by having Alicent support Aegon's claim to the throne for a while, but it's not because she actually wants to. She misunderstands her husband the king's dying words. He says the name Aegon in a daze, and she thinks he's talking about their son, even though he's not, because there are like 30 guys named Aegon in the Targaryen lineage, and he's talking about one of them. So again, in the book, Alicent knows what she wants and goes for it, but on the show, she's motivated by a misunderstanding, which is just way weaker. And then, when Alicent discovers her mistake, she starts shifting her allegiance to Rhaenyra, which is how we end up with her offering up her disabled son for execution and saying she wants to run away with Helaena. I guess because her son has done bad things and is no longer worthy of her protection, and Helaena hasn't and is. This feels so tortured and artificial to me, because it's out of step with how most people understand the nature of love, parental or otherwise. You know, you love who you love, whether or not your loved ones meet some certain standard of morality. It's hard to be selective like this. Oh, and Alicent never once mentions during this scene that someone in Rhaenyra's inner circle effectively murdered her grandson, probably because it would draw attention to how ridiculous this all is.
A son for a son.
The show does its damnedest to frame Alicent's actions as noble and self-sacrificing, but I think they feel way more evil and conniving than anything Hess attributes to Alicent in the book, and a lot less believable. You know, cliches are only bad if you use them wrong. Ambition, cruelty, despair, they're all part of the human condition, and women are human beings, so they should have access to them. A character like Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones definitely flirted with cliches, femme fatale, evil queen, but she came alive as a character in the details and the contradictions, like how Cersei could be phenomenally cruel to people, but still fiercely loved and protected her own children, even when they didn't deserve it. She was bitter and ruthless, but that was after a lifetime of mistreatment taught her to look out for herself first and foremost. Her character incorporated cliches, but she never felt like one herself. But I feel like House of the Dragon would see that Cersei is power-hungry and mean and then pare her back, which would be a huge loss. They seem afraid to let the women on their show be selfish or weak or bloodthirsty. And while I do get why they feel that way, the characters themselves end up feeling less human, because those things are as much a part of humanity as are being selfless and strong and merciful. This paring back happens with the men too. Let's talk about Daemon Targaryen, Rhaenyra's husband, and also her uncle, because Targaryens are still wild like that. In the first season, Daemon comes across as a conflicted, multi-layered character, the kind people loved on Game of Thrones. He deeply resents and envies his brother the king. Daemon thinks he should be in the Iron Throne, not Viserys. But we also see him being very tender and loving towards his brother. We see that Daemon does honestly love Rhaenyra, at least on some level, but he also groomed her as a child, and part of the reason he marries her is because she's heir to the Iron Throne and he's still kind of hoping to sit it one day. All of these contradictions made Daemon a fan favorite in Season 1. And Season 2 seems devoted to getting rid of them. Daemon spends most of the season in a haunted castle where he has very tiresome, very repetitive dreams designed to show him the error of his ways. It all climaxes in a vision he has of Rhaenyra sitting the Iron Throne literally bathed in a halo of golden light, the Chosen One. And after that, he vows never to contest Rhaenyra's leadership again. And I'm sure that's great for the relationship, but it gets rid of a lot of the tension that made these two so compelling to watch in the first place. The show has decided that Daemon is in the good guy bucket, and good guys support the rightful heir to the throne, which the show has decided is Rhaenyra. Likewise, the show has decided that Alicent is in the good guy bucket, so of course she can't support Aegon because Aegon doesn't support Rhaenyra. That's why the show has to make up excuses for why she supports him anyway, at least for a while. She didn't know about the coup, she misunderstood her husband's dying words. Because in this version of the story, it's better for Alicent to be ignorant than for her to want something the producers have decided she's not supposed to want. Everything about this feels either or, up or down, black or white, which misses by a mile what is so good and messy and unpredictable about Martin's work. The most interesting character in Season 2 ends up being Aegon, because he doesn't yet seem tied to this good-bad binary. He wants to do a good job as king, but he sucks at it because he's an immature screw-up. He abuses people, but he also suffers immensely. He's the kind of hard-to-pin-down character I want from shows like this, but too many of the other characters fall very short. So basically, I think the writers on House of the Dragon took a story about people who get caught up in a vicious cycle of violence and turned it into a story about the rightful heir to the throne versus the usurpers, and they were so sensitive about avoiding negative stereotypes that they watered down a lot of their best characters. This is how they made Fire and Blood their own, and I think their version is a lot flatter and just all around worse. So is the lesson here that adaptations should always stick as close to the source material as possible? The answer may surprise you. Or not. The answer is no. Are you surprised by no? After Martin publicly dragged House of the Dragon on his blog, showrunner Ryan Condal talked about the incident to Entertainment Weekly. At first, Condal said that he and Martin collaborated on the show, but at some point, as we got deeper down the road, he just became unwilling to acknowledge the practical issues at hand in a reasonable way. And I think as a showrunner, I have to keep my practical producer hat on and my creative writer, lover of the material hat on at the same time. So Condal doesn't say what he means by practical, but I'm going to suppose that he means the technical difficulties that arise whenever you adapt a story from the page to the screen. TV has limitations that books don't. You got to think about what actors can and can't do, what there's time to shoot, what's left in the budget, etc. So changes are inevitable, and I don't think we should write off adaptations just because they happen. Changes are going to happen. Now, in the case of House of the Dragon, this excuse does not make much sense, because the changes fans are mad about have nothing to do with practicality. What exactly is practical about taking a straightforward coronation scene and turning it into an elaborate, expensive dragon massacre? What about the shooting schedule required the writers to completely change the nature of the relationship between two of the most important characters? I don't think the changes are practical at all. I think the writers made them because they wanted to make them, so I call some bullshit on Condal here. If you want an example of a book-to-screen change that actually does seem driven by practical concerns, consider another high fantasy series, The Wheel of Time, sadly canceled by Amazon just as it was getting really good. There are 14 very big books in the Wheel of Time series, plus a prequel. There was no way a TV show could fit in everything, not unless you want the teenage protagonist to be senior citizens by the time it's over. I remember when I was reading the series, I was a little flummoxed that the second and third books, The Great Hunt, The Dragon Reborn, kind of end in the same way, with our hero Randall Thor fighting and beating an evil dude named Baal-Zaman, or Ishamael, he has many names. So I wasn't surprised when the TV show adapted the second fight, but more or less cut the third, because it needed to cut something, and you might as well cut the stuff that's duplicative. That felt like a practical change to me. I also think it's okay to add new elements to an adaptation as long as the heart of the story remains intact. House of the Dragon did a good job of this in its first season, Before the Dark Days. Another show that's nailing this is AMC's Interview with the Vampire, based on Anne Rice's book. The show changes a lot, and not just for practical reasons. The time period shifts from the late 18th century to the early 20th. The show does a lot more with the framing story, and the two main characters, Louis and Lestat, are now very clearly a couple, whereas in the book it was just sort of implied. These are big changes, but the basic shape of the story remains the same. The show expands on the source material, it tweaks it, it plays with it, but at the end of the day it remains respectful. Plus, a lot of the changes are pretty inspired, so that helps too. And I even think there are times, under very rare circumstances, when an adaptation can completely gut the source material and get away with it. My favorite example of that is Stanley Kubrick's 1980 movie The Shining, based on Stephen King's 1977 book. Even if you've never read the book or seen the movie, you probably know the basics of this story. Jack Torrance gets a job taking care of the Overlook Hotel while everyone's gone for the winter. While he's there, he goes a bit crazy, maybe because of ghosts, or maybe because he's just built that way, and tries to murder his wife and son. Stephen King famously does not like the Shining movie. He does not think it does a good job of adapting his book, and he's right. One of his big objections is that, in the book, Jack Torrance is a basically decent guy who is driven mad by literal ghosts and supernatural creatures. But in the movie, Jack kind of already hates his family in the beginning, and the ghosts, if they're there at all, just give him a little nudge.
So I saw these all as warm characters that were being threatened by forces from without, from ghosts, from real supernatural creatures. Stanley Kubrick saw The Haunting as coming from Jack Torrance, from the Jack Nicholson character, whereas I always saw it from outside. So we had a fundamental difference of opinion about it.
So the movie changes the basic premise of the book. It's no longer really about a haunting. It's about an abusive father and husband. But Kubrick gets away with it because his idea is better. The idea that all the violence and rage and hatred comes from inside Jack is scarier. It's more compelling. It feels more real than him being harried by ghosts and ghouls. And that's obviously just my opinion, but in this case, we kind of have a control group. In 1997, Stephen King wrote a TV miniseries version of The Shining that sticks far closer to the book. And this might be the first you're hearing about it, because it kind of came and went and no one remembers it today. Be honest, when you think of The Shining, do you think of goopy-faced Steven Weber from Wings chasing his family with a mallet? Or do you think of Jack Nicholson saying, "Here's Johnny"? That's a rhetorical question. Everyone thinks of Jack Nicholson because Stanley Kubrick won. His version of the story is just better, and that's why it's lasted. But Ryan Condal and Sarah Hess are not Stanley Kubrick, and their idea for House of the Dragon is not better than Martin's, so they do not get away with it.
We've been here for some time.
A third season of House of the Dragon is on the way. It sounds like they're doubling down on the Allison and Rhaenyra versus the world angle, so I've pretty much given up hope of getting a book-accurate show, but I do genuinely hope they find a way of making their version of the story work, even if it's not the version I want. I know I've been dogging them the entire video, but I think Sarah Hess and Ryan Condal are plenty talented. I just wish they'd had more trust in the source material. I think Martin's work is good enough to warrant that. That said, one of the reasons making a good adaptation is so difficult is because what it means to be a good adaptation changes depending on the source text, on the people involved, on the time when it's made, and so on and so forth. Sometimes sticking as close to the source material as possible is the best possible choice. That worked well for Game of Thrones for the first several seasons. Sometimes the text needs to be updated, and there are even times when you can take the book in a completely different direction if your idea is just that good. But most of the time, it isn't that good. And yet we still constantly have adaptations that try to make it their own. Part of the reason may be that a lot of Hollywood writers won't have any other chance to see their ideas on screen. The fantasy author Brandon Sanderson, who writes about 80 books a year and yet has never had anything adapted, once talked about a time early in his career when a writer tried to turn his story, The Emperor's Soul, into a movie. Sanderson was excited at first, but then he read the screenplay and was confused to see that it had basically nothing in common with his story but the names. And Sanderson realized that what the writer really wanted to do was tell their own original epic fantasy story, but they couldn't get anyone to spend money on an unproven property. So they optioned Sanderson's story and then slipped their own ideas in there, hoping that Sanderson's name would help actually get the movie made. Sanderson thinks this is an ongoing problem in Hollywood, and I wonder if that's part of what happened with House of the Dragon. Maybe it's not so much that Ryan Condal and Sarah Hess hate Fire and Blood, but more that they'd rather express their own ideas than adapt someone else's. And mind you, that's a bad excuse. I think if it's your job to adapt a book, and that book is worth adapting like Fire and Blood is, you should do your best to adapt it right. But that's easier said than done. Adapting a book for the screen is a long, complicated process, and a ton can go wrong. Ideally, you want someone in charge who loves the source material, and Ryan Condal does say he loves Fire and Blood. But if you love it too much, maybe you're not willing to change the things that actually do need changing, because there's always something. Getting an outsider's perspective can be helpful, but you can't step so far outside the story that you lose track. And again, sometimes you can lose track and get away with it. If Condal and Hess had changed Fire and Blood in a way that actually made the story better, I wouldn't be complaining. But they made it worse, so I am. If you're looking for a faithful adaptation of Martin's work, the upcoming Game of Thrones prequel, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, looks like it sticks very closely to his Dunk and Egg novellas, which has me excited. As for House of the Dragon, I wish it the best, but I can't help but feel a little sad that we didn't get the show that was promised.
What are you reading?
The Dance of Dragons. It's the story of the fight between Rhaenyra Targaryen and her half-brother Aegon for control of the Seven Kingdoms. When people started declaring for one of them or the other, Their fight divided the kingdoms in two. Brothers fought brothers. Dragons fought dragons. By the time it was over, thousands were dead. And it was a disaster for the Targaryens as well. They never truly recovered.
If you'd had to choose between Rhaenyra and Aegon, who would you have chosen?
I wouldn't have chosen either. It's all the choosing sides that made everything so horrible.